me introduce Anne. So Anne is the Virginia Director of Outreach and Advocacy for CBF. I wanted to get that right because it's very sharp and clean. I like it. So she educates and engages citizens around water quality issues and advocates for water quality issues in the General Assembly and trains up citizens on how to do that too. She has a degree in landscape horticulture from North Carolina State University and is a certified Chesapeake Bay landscape professional designer and installer. And she has included numerous projects around the Bay watershed and in Virginia to help improve water quality with these plantings. She's done tree plantings at parks and schools. She has done ring gardens at a whole host of different locations. So I have had the great honor of helping with those and witnessing the knowledge and joy that Anne has around planting gardens and especially protecting water quality with her gardens. She's on the board of Trees Virginia and vice chair of the Bay Program's Citizen Advisory Committee and lives in Fredericksburg and has two beautiful and brilliant daughters and a lovely and cute dog who you will see momentarily as well. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you, Blair. That's so funny. I do have two brilliant daughters. Well, yeah, just a little bit about me. I'll just say I've been gardening since I was little. I mean, little. My grandmother had me planting nasturtiums and French marigolds in our vegetable garden. My grandparents had a half-acre vegetable garden. My mom is, she's 82 and she's got this amazing perennial garden that is the envy of all of her neighbors. But she's old school, and if there are any native plants in that garden, it's accidental, it's not intentional. But I wanted to tell you that there were two things that changed the way that I started gardening, and they happened about a decade ago. And since then, I've really sort of changed the way, not just the way that I garden, but the way that I think about and which plants I prize. So the first thing that happened was, you know, Dr. Doug Tallamy, who's a professor at the University of Delaware, released a book called Bringing Nature Home, How to Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants. So that came out, you know, just a little over a decade ago, and the book was eye-opening. I reference his research sort of throughout this presentation. I've got all of his books. He's just released a new one, and I've not read that one, but I'm looking forward to it. Well, the second thing that happened was I hired Robert Jennings almost a decade ago, and you know, we invited him to our house for dinner. I think it was like his first day at work, and that was May of 2012. And those of you who know Robert, you know that he's a masterful educator. He graciously shares his deep knowledge of native plants and their interconnectedness with all living things. And we were walking around in my yard, and I was, you know, and I was strutting a little bit because, of course, I've got a degree in landscape horticulture. And I said, I've got a lot of native plants, right? And he sort of smiled sheepishly and said, well, you've got that giant white oak in your yard and some pine trees down by the street, but that's about it. Well, that started, that conversation really started what has been a 10-year journey of discovery and wonder. And I hope that I can share some of that joy that I've found with native plants with you in the next 45 minutes or so. So here's some things that I hope that you'll take away from tonight's presentation. So the first is, you know, why what we do in our landscape matters to the health of our creeks and streams and rivers in the Bay. There's a direct connection to water quality. I hope that you'll walk away learning what pollinators need from us to succeed and what we can do to help restore some dwindling populations. I'm going to give you some design guidelines that will help you transition to a more pollinator-friendly yard. And then finally, just some additional resources to get you started. And I'll just say that, you know, I'll confess I'm a pragmatist. I've got both natives and ornamentals in my yard. When we moved a few years ago to Fredericksburg, I didn't pull up every single foundational plant and put a native in its place, because unless you've just built a new home, most of us aren't working with a blank slate, and I feel like gardens are like people, we're sort of all works in progress. So the focus of this presentation is really on transitioning. I'll just say, before I change slides, that's one of my favorite perennials is being photobombed by my black lab. That's the cardinal flower, which is a magnet for hummingbirds. All right, so you're familiar with CBF. You know that our mission is to save the Bay, and there's lots of adjectives to describe it. It's a national treasure. It's, you know, Mencken described it as the immense protein factory. It's been called the crown jewel of the world's estuaries. Well, every drop of rain that falls within that yellow outlined area, that's the Bay watershed, eventually makes its way through 21,000 streams and 100,000 small creeks and unnamed tributaries to the Bay. The Chesapeake Bay's land to water ratio is 14:1. That's the largest of any coastal water body in the world. So that's also why all of our actions on land have such a big impact on the Bay's health. And we're making tremendous progress towards reducing the flow of pollutants that are coming into the Bay. So wastewater treatment plants have led the way. They're greatly reducing nutrients. You know, air emissions from coal-fired power plants and from cars have been going down, and farmers are increasingly adopting best management practices to keep manure and topsoil from running off their land. But the most stubborn challenge is stormwater. And that's the water that runs off our streets and parking lots and driveways and goes untreated into the nearest storm drain. And that storm drain probably has an outfall in a nearby creek, and eventually that's going to converge with a stream and a river and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. Well, we've got approximately 18 million people in the Bay watershed and 150,000 moving into the watershed every year. And as what happens is we continue to add impervious surface and remove some of the forests that act like natural filters. So why is the Bay Foundation giving a webinar on creating a backyard buffet for birds, bees, and butterflies? Well, it's because those 18 million people are managing millions of acres of grass lawns. And lawns are better than bare soil from a stormwater perspective, but they're just about as impervious as your driveway. And Virginians are managing a lot of lawn, over 1 million acres. That's more than we have in corn and soybeans, and we've got more in turf than the entire area of the state of Rhode Island. So got together with Joe Wood, our senior scientist, and we ran the numbers. And if every homeowner would just take out 1/10 of their managed lawn and convert that to conservation landscaping with native plants, we'd be able to reduce the nitrogen loads to the Chesapeake Bay by over 250,000 pounds. That's about 13% of the nitrogen reductions needed to restore the Bay. So here's another reason why natives are better for water quality. They're better able to hold soil in place. The deep roots also store carbon, and these plants are more drought tolerant. And think of the roots of switchgrass, Panica virginiana. They can go down 12 feet. And if you've ever seen the picture of cross-cut soil on the prairies, that rich soil that today is our breadbasket, that's a result of years of prairie grasses breaking down and feeding the soil. All right, so I hope by now I've got you thinking, okay, I'm going to give up 1/10 of my lawn. I just have to give up 1/10 of my grass. Let's get to the meat of the subject. Why does it matter to birds, bees, and butterflies? We'll start with the birds. It was about a year ago, we were all shocked by this headline that the New York Times had, that nearly 1/3 of our wild birds had vanished since 1970. They were reporting on an article that had appeared in the journal Science that 2.9 billion birds had disappeared over the last 50 years. Well, that's my lifetime and maybe several of your lifetimes as well. And since, and part of the reason why is that over 10 million acres of land has been developed from 1982 to 1997. And in the Bay watershed, between 1990 and 2005, we lost an estimated 100 acres of forest each day. And that rate fell during the recession in 2008, but it's still unsustainable. So what's the result? So the birds have fewer places to safely rest during migration and to raise their young. And most importantly, our lawns and our pavement don't give them enough food or shelter or insects for them to feed their young. And about 80% of land is privately held. So that means that it's up to us, right? There's a huge opportunity for us to do better. Well, you sort of feel for this mockingbird, right? All those babies saying, me. But 96% of terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. And not just any insects. During Doug Tallamy's webinar a few weeks ago, this blew me away. You know, although chickadees will come and they'll visit our feeder to get seeds throughout the year, it only feeds caterpillars to its young. And so take a wild guess how many it requires to rear a clutch. It requires, according to his graduate student, between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to rear a clutch. And they forage, chickadees forage no further than 50 meters from the nest. So that's your yard or maybe your neighbor's yard. That's their food supply. And you might ask, well, why caterpillars instead of other bugs? And I'm going to borrow from Doug Tallamy again, because he described them as little sausages. I love that. Lots of fat, lots of protein, and not a lot of chitin. So chitin is the exoskeleton, like in a grasshopper or a beetle that's really crunchy. Well, caterpillars don't have that, and so they're really easy to regurgitate. So how do we landscape for caterpillars? And the answer is trees. And not necessarily all trees. I'll just say not all trees are created equal. Some are host to more Lepidoptera larvae than others. That giant white oak that Robert noticed in my front yard a decade ago, as well as some other oaks, support over 500 butterfly and moth species. I'll just note that my mother wonders what I have against crepe myrtles, and you will see that they're not on this list. All right, so, you know, the bottom left is a spicebush swallowtail. It feeds only on the laurel family, so that's red bay and sweetbay and sassafras and spicebush. These are all small trees, small shrubs that are native to Virginia. The eastern tiger swallowtail, the one on the right, is gathering nectar from a sunflower. Its larval host plants include the tulip tree and wild black cherry and the sweetbay magnolia. Whereas for the zebra tail butterfly, the larval host plants are pawpaws, a Semina species, and throughout most of its range, that's its only host tree. So this is a sweetbay silkmoth. It was named after its host tree, Magnolia virginiana. These moths are, like most, are diurnal. Their mating period is in the afternoon, and their lifespan is only 2 weeks, long enough to mate and to lay eggs. So I hope that what you're hearing now is there's, for many of these Lepidoptera species, there's a one-to-one relationship between the butterfly and the moth and the tree. So if we want to support butterflies and if we want to landscape for caterpillars for our birds, we've got to include these host plants in our landscape. All right, well, we've talked about how valuable trees are to supply food for a variety of moths and butterflies, but you probably know that there's a very specialized relationship between the monarch butterfly and milkweed. So the adult butterfly gathers nectar from the flowers. They lay their eggs on the underside of the leaves. The larvae eat the leaves. On the left-hand side is a swamp milkweed that's perfect for wetter locations. It gets fairly large, and then its counterpart is the one that is in the center of the slide. That's Asclepios tuberosa. That's the butterfly weed. It's a shame we call it a weed because it's really pretty. All right, so here's another adaptation. It's a hummingbird moth. It's clear wing, and it's gathering nectar from Monarchs. So each type of hummingbird moth has a long proboscis, and it's adapted to pollinating long tubular flowers. For those of you who grow tomatoes, the tomato hornworm caterpillar will eventually morph into a hawk moth or a sphinx moth, which are both types of hummingbird moths. All right, so let's switch from Lepidoptera to bees. So Virginia is home to over 430 native bee species. And I'll say before Nancy Adamson came and spoke to a Bees, Trees, and Clean Water forum that we had several years ago, I thought that there was a honeybee and a sweat bee, a yellow jacket, and a bumblebee. Well, yellow jackets aren't bees, they're wasps. And boy, that webinar just, or that forum completely opened my eyes. So this is Pitothrix bombiformis on rose mallow. It's called the hibiscus turret bee. It's also called an eastern digger bee. And it looks a lot like a bumblebee, but it's not. You know, we see rose mallow on, in the coastal areas, the Hampton Roads area, and in wetland areas. The female collects pollen on her legs, and she takes that back to her brood. So Sam Droege, who's with the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, he's a bee expert. He has studied native bees all around the world, and he came to speak to our Voices class. And he said that 80% of our native bees are generalists. They're not picky about what plant they gather pollen from, but 20% are specialists, and they will only gather pollen from 1 to 3 species of plants. Well, Virginia is one of 3 states most inhabited by specialist bees. And I've put a link there for the Virginia Native Plant Society. They have a list of plants specifically that support specialist bees. So some trees and shrubs that are important to them include the willow, which has 8 species of specialists, redbud, dogwoods, especially the osier and the silky dogwoods, and winterberry. So another note about bees is they have different breeding cycles. So this hibiscus bee, it breeds from May to September, whereas others will breed from August to October. So that's another reason to have a diversity of flowering plants to offer pollen when your bees need it. So in early spring, before perennials are blooming, bees are out foraging, particularly the bumblebees. They've been hibernating during the winter. They'll come out, and these early flowering trees, the red maple on the left, the redbud in the center, the serviceberry, which is also called the shadbush on the right-hand side. These provide much needed pollen in late March and early April before any other perennials are blooming. All right, so now you're starting to get a sense of why plant diversity is so important to our landscapes. And I hope I've got you just pumped up and you're ready to go set that buffet table. What are you going to do first? I would start by removing invasive plants. And that's not the sexiest thing to do in a garden, but you want to do it before they escape into the wild. And the sooner you do it, the easier the job will be. Until you get them out of there, they're taking up valuable real estate. And if you're wondering if something's invasive or not, I'll just say they stay green all year long. And if you see something that's green in January, it's probably invasive. I'll also note that your neighbors will thank you if you get rid of that ivy before it goes across the fence or under the fence into their yard. So these photos on the left and the center photo, they were taken at Belle Isle State Park in Richmond. And you can see that that in the leaf litter, you know, that's where we should have been seeing, we were there in early March, mid-March, that's where we should have seen the spring ephemerals coming up, but it's just completely covered with invasive species. So if you're wondering which invasive species to start with, I'd suggest maybe starting with the vines. So the picture on the far right-hand side, that tree is covered with ivy. It's a danger to the tree, to people, to structures. And I just learned this a couple weeks ago that ivy starts to fruit when it goes vertical. When it's on the ground, you don't see any berries, but once it goes up, it starts producing berries and the birds disperse the seeds. So this is populating a whole lot of ivy in Fredericksburg. All right, so I'll just say that a couple things. The Department of Forestry offers this great sheet on non-native invasive control. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how to control invasive species. I will also point out that blueridgeprism.org, they have individual fact sheets about different invasive species, when they were introduced, how to treat it, what time of year it's best to treat it. But this Department of Forestry sheet, it explains the best time of year and whether mechanical or chemical treatment is required. So it's a great resource. Well, so ask for and purchase natives. Eventually, nurseries will stop carrying invasives. We've got so many common landscape plants that are spreading outside of your yard and into disturbed soil elsewhere. And there are many excellent alternatives. So Nandina on the left produces berries that are toxic to birds. Autumn olive on the right, it also produces berries that the birds love, but boy, it has taken over some of our natural refuges. Barberry is, you know, really, it's got really beautiful color, but it is also spreading. You see it now on that transition area between sort of pastures and forest. And the same thing with winged burning bush. I'll just say that I just was looking this up, and if you Google winged burning bush, you can find it at every single nursery. And the description says, gardeners who want a burst of crimson color in the fall should learn how to grow burning bush. There's so many good alternatives to it. Also the genus Miscanthus, there's about 20 different species, maiden grass, Chinese silvergrass, Japanese silvergrass. I love grasses, but we've got a whole host of native grasses that will do, you know, will do your yard justice, as well as a calorie pear. So maybe we can get that out of our landscapes too. It breaks my heart when I see somebody who's doing new construction and they choose a calorie pear for the, you know, the tree that they put in the front yard. All right, so this drawing, I know it looks, for somebody whose degree is in landscape horticulture, you're going, she majored in what? Okay, you've removed invasive species and now you're wondering, where are you gonna put your conservation landscaping? Okay, well, let's start with the obvious. Look at your yard and where is grass not doing very well? Maybe it's too shady, maybe it's too wet, maybe it's too dry, or it might be on a really steep hillside and dangerous to mow. And remember, a few slides back, I showed that native plants have deeper roots, so they can hold the soil of in that hillside in place. But the next thing you may consider doing is just creating a sketch of your property. It just takes a few minutes. You can Google your address. You can switch to satellite view. If you right click, it'll bring up a menu. You can measure the distance or the area. And then, you know, this is a $1.99 graph paper, and a scale of 1 inch equals 10 feet. Fits pretty well on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So if you got a 1/4 acre lot, it works pretty well. So this is your starting point. So now you want to walk around and you want to take some notes on your baseline sheet. And these are some of the things that you want to observe. You want to know your north, south, east, and west exposure. So for instance, if you've got a northern exposure, it won't get full sun until the summer months. Or maybe you want to know where your southern exposure is, because maybe you want to plant some trees to give the back of your house some shade, or your southern exposure some shade. Maybe your neighbor's yard looks like a used car lot and you want to have a green screen, or maybe you've got a gorgeous view and you want to frame that. If you know the history of the property, that's helpful. I'll just say our house in Fredericksburg, I found out later that I was wondering why I had no soil, really. It's because it was once the neighborhood tennis court. And so we started digging down to put trees in, and after about, I don't know, 2 to 3 inches, we'd hit cinder. And I was like, what on earth? Well, that affected the soil chemistry. And so we've had to like amend a lot of soil to get stuff to grow well. So you also want to pay attention to where water runs. It's great to be out in your yard when it rains. Where does it pool? If you've got wet spaces, then you've probably got some compacted soil, maybe that you're going to have to amend that. You're going to want to know which areas are sunny and which ones are in full shade. So take that sheet and mark where you've got trees, and just sort of the conditions that you observe. And also, where do utilities run? All right, and then you want to take an inventory. So natural communities, there's a link here, so when you get the PDF, you'll be able to click on this definition. But if you go to a wilderness area and an area that's been undisturbed, and pay attention, you'll see which plants grow with one another. So the plants at a site, they're typically related to factors such as the bedrock type, the soil chemistry, the slope, the elevation. So the areas in Hampton Roads, for instance, are not going to look at all like the areas that are in the Piedmont or west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So the next thing is, as you're sort of walking around your yard, pay attention to what brings you joy. Have you ever seen a plant that looks more joyful than this woodland phlox? It is a favorite of deer and rabbits, but I've got it in the backyard. I can't grow it in my front yard because the deer browse it too much. But in the back, you can see I've got some sedum around it, which is something the rabbits don't eat. So that's sort of my guardrail around my woodland phlox. So like Marie Kondo says, if it doesn't bring you joy, let it go. But also make a note as you're going around and sort of keep a running count of how many species you have, right? Because what you're trying to do is to continue to increase biodiversity in your yard. All right, so now you know what you've got. So here are a few ways to think about planting with pollinators in mind. You got to think in at least 2 dimensions. The time of year that the plants are in bloom and which vertical layer they fit in. And vertical meaning both above and below the soil, because deep-rooted plants are going to draw nutrients from a different area of the soil than very shallow-rooted plants, which is why you can have them right next to each other and they're not necessarily going to compete. So I would encourage you to avoid just planting one plant unless you're sort of testing it out. In the foreground here, you sort of see my test bed. But if you have room and your site matches the plant needs, try to plant in groups of 3 to 5. Note that pollinators are attracted to yellows and purples. Hummingbirds are attracted to reds. So this is a picture of spiderwort in April. And then in the fall, it switches over to rudbeckia. So again, you want a large space. You want large drifts because it's more efficient for bees to forage. And so I think of yourself sort of as an air traffic controller. and you're turning on the runway lights, and you've got this approaching squadron of foraging birds and bees and butterflies. So you want to make sure that it's easy for them to see it and that they don't have to spend a lot of energy looking for that source of pollen or that source of nectar. So you may have more room than you think to introduce native species, and particularly if you grow up, if you go vertical. If you've got a shed or an arbor or a fence where you want to add some color, you can add coral honeysuckle or trumpet creeper. This is just like the slide on my first slide. These plants also attract hummingbirds. The coral honeysuckle is host to 33 spring caterpillars, including the spring blue azure butterflies and clearwing moths. It produces fruit that attracts birds. What's not pictured here is, and I'm sorry I didn't have a picture of it, is a native clematis, Clematis virginiana, Virgin's bower. It is beautiful, it's lovely, it's got delicate white flowers. It looks sort of like a bridal veil. And then on the left, you see passion flower or maypop. If you can see the fruit that's right in the top of the slide, that green fruit in the background is edible, and it makes a loud pop when it's crushed, and that's how it got its name. All right, so now we're going to talk layers. Let's go down to the ground. I am in love with ferns, and there are dozens of species of ferns. There are thousands that are native across the world, but there are dozens that are native to Virginia, and they have a surprisingly wide tolerance for different soil types. Like some of them will do just fine in clay. Most of them like, well-drained and highly organic matter or highly organic soils, but some are pretty tough and they'll do okay in clay soils. Their sunshade requirements are different. There are some that'll do just fine in almost full sun, whereas others really like dappled shade to be happy. I'll just say one of my other favorite plants is this wild geranium. It blooms in April and May, and then it is done. So, just one of those spring plants that, again, that brings you joy. So this is a picture of May apples and Solomon seal. And some people may not think that May apples are a ground cover, because they grow up to be, 12 inches tall or so. And Solomon seal is the plant that's behind it that's got the little white flowers. These are both natives, and they play an important role, not just covering the ground, but they're also a source of food for one of our species that is, again, that's disappearing. The Mayapples, this is their blossom underneath those really large leaves. And these will turn into little green fruits about the size of your thumb. And then those are eaten by these guys. And that's how a new colony gets started. So box turtles disperse those seeds from one place to another, and that's how we get new May apples. So here's another just small plant that, again, it doesn't spread very well, so maybe it's not a typical ground cover, but it doesn't get more than maybe 6 inches tall. It's perfect for rock gardens. And that's the green and gold. I'll just mention that there are two others that I probably should have mentioned. I don't have good photos of. One is partridge berry. It's a sweet little plant. It hugs the ground. It's got little red berries on it. And the second one is foam flower. That spreads by rhizomes. And so that's really perfect for a ground cover. All right, so let's move up from ground covers to shrubs and some perennials. I'll just note that the very first thing that we did when we moved to Fredericksburg is we pulled up the winged burning bush that was here, and we replaced it with Virginia sweet spire, which is Itea virginica, and an oak leaf hydrangea. Now you can see on the left-hand side, you can see the strawberries in this bed. what you can't quite see is that in between the strawberries are onions and lettuce, as well as parsley and borage, and asparagus is up against that wall, because they're all companion plants for strawberries, and they will ward off disease and pests that could do my strawberries in. So you can also see the netting to keep the birds off of them. All right, so speaking of replacing burning bush, here's another alternative. You know, blueberries give you the same gorgeous fall color, but you get the added benefit of being able to have fresh blueberry muffins and to freeze a few quarts. They do need acid soil, but generally you can pretty easily amend the soil to accommodate their needs. So I apologize, this is not a great picture. In the foreground is spice bush. In the center with the red berries, that's winterberry, that's Ilex verticillata. It also prefers acid soil. And then there's in the far back up against the fence back there is a Sweetbay magnolia. And I include that because you may look at that and say, God, that tree's going to get big eventually. And it will, but it will also stay tall and narrow when it's confined. I wish I'd gotten a picture of this now 5 years later, because it's about 20 feet tall, but it's still in that vertical space. On the right-hand side is a viburnum. This is the arrowwood viburnum. They are generally carefree. They don't have many pests. They're incredibly hardy. I'll just ask you to pay attention to which one you're putting in. I put in, I think it's Viburnum pulaski, not really paying attention. It looked really great at the nursery. I thought, this is a really beautiful, beautiful plant. It's a nice shrub, and I think it'll look really good up against this fence. So I planted it. You know, later realized that sucker gets to be between 12 and 15 feet tall and just about as wide. So you can imagine I've been trying to figure out, am I going to move it? Am I going to give it away to somebody who really has a space for it? Or am I going to continue to prune it back hard after it blooms every year? I haven't decided yet, but anyway, that's what happens if I'm not paying attention. So this is a photo of a red twig dogwood. You know, if you've got a wet space in your yard, this bush is, it loves wet areas. You can see that I've got this capturing water from the downspout. In the fall and winter, it has this gorgeous red stem, and you can use it for, dry it and bring it in for cuttings. Gives beautiful winter seasonal color. And just if you happen to have a white fence, for instance, this is really, or when it snows, just the contrast is really gorgeous. All right, so let's go up a layer. So understory trees. We talked earlier about spring flowering redbuds and dogwoods and how they're blooming before other trees have filled out their leaves. They will thrive in dappled shade, as will the ones that are listed here. If you walk around natural communities and you look in your woods, you'll see, hornbeam is usually, it's a good small understory tree. If you've got a wet area, then maybe you've got pawpaws. They generally need something that's pretty wet. Service berries, also called the shad bush, comes single stem and multi-stemmed. Story about why it's called shad bush. John Page Williams shared this a few years ago in his book, that the Indians named it when it was, it indicated when it bloomed, when the shad bush bloomed was when the shad were running up the river. And sure enough, I live in Fredericksburg, and when my shad bush is blooming, then I can go down the river and the herring are coming up. So anyway, I just thought that was cool. And also the Sweetbay magnolia. I already showed you a picture of that one. All right. So Blair asked me, and other people have asked me, what's my favorite tree? And honestly, the answer is all of them. I can't tell you how many photos I've got in my phone of me hugging trees. My kids, they may be brilliant, but they're tired of me hugging trees and making them take pictures of me. I'm really partial to oaks and river birches because they're so tough and because I love their bark. I love the smooth bark and the copper leaves of beeches. And I'm in love with the bright red leaves of the black gum. I think in the fall, it's like the prettiest tree ever. So this picture on the left-hand side, we had a storm this winter that had just passed through. And I went outside in the late afternoon sun. And have you ever had those moments where you're like, gosh, I wish there was somebody else here to see this. This light is so amazing. So I took a picture of it, and I got to tell you, the picture does not do justice to how gorgeous that was. So the right-hand side is a picture of me hugging a tree at Penn State. For those of you who are Penn State fans, this is on the campus. So when you're thinking about canopy trees, just remember natural communities, right? Plant what's in your region. You know, remember the value of those trees to wildlife. So remember back to natural communities, and I just sort of picked the top 6 from Dr. Talamy's list, but you know, the oaks, the cherries, the willows. I was talking earlier about how willows have multiple benefits for Lepidoptera, birches, poplars, crab apples. So again, just try to look at that list and think, how can I add the most value possible to our habitat? All right, so I'm showing you this slide really just to say you don't need a lot of space to add a lot of diversity. So we put in this conservation landscaping last fall, and you know, the owner gave us full range, and she said, whatever you want to plant is fine. She had already planted those sedum in the front, so we let her keep those, but we added asters and goldenrod, you know, some of the spring ephemeral plants. So she's also got phlox in there. So we brought her some lupins. So she's got, you know, a wide variety of plants that are gonna bloom across multiple seasons. Okay, I'll get a little preachy here, sorry. But before you head out to the nursery, invest in a soil test. A lot of folks get it for their lawns, and that is great, but it's also a tremendous value. So the pH of the soil, whether it's acidic or whether it's alkaline, really tells you that particularly if it's acidic, that certain nutrients are not available to the plants if the pH is too low. So some things will do really well. You know, azaleas and hollies and camellias, they may be perfectly, and blueberries, of course, they'll be perfectly happy in a low pH soil, but most trees will not. So if you think about adding trees, you're either going to have to lime your soil and amend it before you put those trees in, or plant something else there. So it's worth the $16, or excuse me, the $10. We'll get the full package. Yeah, $16 for everything. It's a steal. All right, these books will change your life. You know, make sure that I've put the link here for how you can order those. They are by region, and that's great because the plants that are going to do well on Hampton Roads and the Eastern Shore are not going to tolerate the colder temperatures and higher elevations of the Western region. So they're great. They really do a good job of illustrating regional differences. And Virginia says that if you, in a few minutes, Natasha's going to drop a link into a pledge to plant natives. Virginia Whitmer said that she would send you that decal on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. So this, if you go to this website, they are in the middle of a series called Landscaping with Virginia Natives. if you may have already heard the Doug Tallamy lecture, which was, again, mind-blowing. He's so good. But they're doing 12 webinars for gardeners about landscaping with natives. They're doing some March through May, and then they've got some in the fall, September through November. It's only $10 for all 12 webinars. And they had 2,600 people registered as of last week, and they have a capacity of 3,000. So if everybody on this webinar, you know, goes and registers, you'll really bump their numbers up, but it's really tremendous. So, you know, here's another tremendous resource is the Virginia Native Plant Society. This is the go-to place if I'm traveling to an area and I want to know, well, what native plant nurseries are close to me, then I would go here to look for their list. They also have a list of regional plant sales, seed swaps, and they have an annual workshop, which is, again, this year, I think this year it was virtual, but I'm looking forward to attending in person next year. So here's another resource. You know, it can get expensive, right? Putting conservation landscaping, depending on whether or not you decide to go whole hog or not. And you know, you may decide at the end of this webinar, well, I'm just going to go get that one native plant, and that'd be great. But if you really want to put in a larger project, there are some financial resources to help. And one is the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, VCAP. The way that you find out about that is you go to contact your local soil and water conservation district, and they've got cost share up to 75%, depending on the practice for putting in different types of best management practices, including conservation landscaping. All right, so maybe you're all in and you want to completely get rid of every blade of grass that's in your yard, and my hat is off to you, but maybe you don't know where to start. If you want to completely overhaul your landscape, then this is the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professionals website. It's a certification program, and everybody that's gone through it has learned how to create a sustainable landscaping project. I highly recommend it. I'll say the folks that I went through class with were tremendous. They've got a deep knowledge of native plants. There's always something that they're willing to share. A lot of value. So if you're thinking about designing, if you're thinking about just completely redoing your yard and you want to hire an outside professional, I'd encourage you to start here to check these guys out. Okay, well, I hope that I've inspired you to shrink your lawn and add some native plants to it. The declining population of birds and bees and butterflies, it's pretty alarming, but I feel like we have the power to reverse course. I'll just say, like I shared earlier, we have all planted the wrong plant in the wrong place, and maybe we've even killed a few by accident, but that's okay. We learn by doing. So go visit some of the amazing public gardens that we've got in our state, and go peruse the spring plant sales that are happening, and take a chance on a native and bring it back and create some habitat. And with that, I'll stop sharing the slides and we'll answer some questions.
Yes. So I know out there in like webinar land, you know, it's all quiet and we can't see your faces. So I'm going to just, yay, Anne, that was so wonderful. And for everyone that's listening, I will add, I used to work for Anne for 4 years and had just learned so much. And now I work for a different department within the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So this was just a joy to be able to sit and relive 4 years with you in the last 50 minutes. And we got great questions. So those of you that are with us, you can put your questions in the chat. I've got some that have been coming in, so we'll start with those and I'll work through the rest of your questions. But because we have such a large audience, definitely use that Q&A function. So first couple of questions, let's see where I'm gonna start. For shrubs and herbaceous plants, is it better to plant large quantities of a few plants or small quantities with a wide variety? I know.
Yeah, that's a tough question. All right, so back to foraging. So you need to plant enough that you're going to attract the pollinator in the first place, right? So there's got to be some visual cue, particularly birds, right? They're flying way up here when they're migrating, and and they're looking for places to land. And so they've got to have enough color to know that, hey, there's something down here for me to eat. There's a rest area down there. So but again, I'd encourage you to sort of think in layers, because you can add so much, taking up sort of a 1 foot by 1 foot footprint. And that's that 1 by 1 square. You could have something going vertical. You could have a shrub there. You could have, you could have, a ground cover there, and you would have added 3 plants within the 1 space.
If I had my way, it would be 1 plant and it would be absolute chaos. But I learned from Anne the aesthetics of your eye and groupings and odd numbers. And so a couple of other questions.
That's what 4 years will get you, Blair.
I know. And I still have looked at the lines I've planted and been like, how did that not end up in the organized fashion? Anyway, that's beside the point. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat. If you don't mind, put them in the Q&A, just because the chat also is getting a lot of suggestions and things about where you can get native plants. So if you have a question, definitely go to that Q&A, not necessarily to the chat, because it might get lost. So let's see, a couple other questions. Can you give any suggestions for mammals? So voles, moles, deer, and rabbits. And I'm assuming that means how to not get your plants eaten and not how to attract them.
Yeah, so there's I listened to the Washington Gardener podcast, and they were talking about, oh gosh, it's not Deer Be Gone, but it's something like that. And and they were saying if you sprinkle it around your shrubs, that it won't necessarily stop them from eating hostas, which is buffet, right? For deer, it's like, hey, come eat me. But for things like azaleas, what I used to do is I'd put netting over my azaleas, deer netting, you couldn't see it. For voles, this is really a little bit of interconnectedness, but now that I've got predator birds, I've got raptors, right, that are coming in, and I guarantee they've taken care of some of the vole population, because I used to have them pretty bad. So anything you can do to encourage and don't let the cats eat the voles and think that that's the answer either, because they've taken out a lot of our songbird population.
I'm also having flashbacks to, I believe you had a very friendly groundhog.
Yeah, if anybody knows how to get rid of a groundhog, I'm all ears. I really can't shoot them in downtown Fredericksburg, but I would if I could.
It's a great suggestion about the raptors, though. Very, very good suggestion. And let's see. Can you suggest a privacy hedge for Hampton Roads?
Okay. I would think I'd go with a couple things. It depends on how tall you want it to be. So think about things like Eastern red cedar, right? It's a tree, right? But it'll definitely be a hedge, and it provides berries. Gosh, forgot the name of the bird, but it migrates in sort of February and March, and it comes in and just clears all the berries off of our red cedar. So that's one thing. That's not really a hedge. There's a lot of viburnums that I'd suggest. And Robert, my guess is you're here and you've probably got some ideas you want to drop in the chat. That'd be great. Ammonia. Oh, okay.
Oh, we're getting some great suggestions in the chat, my friends, about moles, make a trap with peanut butter with a flower pot over it.
I did that. Yeah.
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 That's very ingenious. And just like Anne suggested earlier, those native plant books are amazing. I love looking at them. So I know the person that asked that question, I sent a link to that, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you're going to get a copy of this presentation afterwards. So you can find the links to all of those native plant guides. But I love thinking about like, oh, I need a hedge and what's the plant?
Becky, that's a great idea. Becky suggested wax myrtle, which I completely forgot about. So thank you very much. That'd be great.
Oh.
And thank you. It is cedar waxwings. You're absolutely right. Thank you.
Many years ago, Anne sent me a photo of a cedar waxwing and said, look at this beautiful bird. And I was like, oh, ever since then, cedar waxwings have been my favorite. They look like I have makeup on. Okay, so we did get a question about, this is very interesting, Anne. I'm very curious to hear what you say about this. Nandina, can you keep it and cut all the berries off?
I think that's a great idea. I mean, I've got two little dwarf nandina in my backyard, and I honestly didn't even realize that they were there. They're sort of tucked in between other stuff. They don't produce berries. Yeah, and I don't think that they are. I actually don't believe that they're getting outside of their of their planting range. I don't think that they're like barberries and euonymus alata, the winged burning bush. They really are sort of moving into those wild areas, those developed or disturbed soils. I don't think that Nandina is doing that.
That's dedication. You love your animals and you want to get rid of those berries. More power to you. Is purple passion vine successful as a transplant? Do you know?
I don't know.
That one would be interesting.
The picture there, or the picture on the slide presentation, I took at a farm that's in downtown Richmond, right where Tricycle Gardens used to have their farm off of 9th Street, and that's where that picture came from. That's covering their shed. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful vine.
Mm-hmm. Good question. I know that you mentioned earlier the native plants page where people can look up nurseries, but one of the questions we got was, where can you buy milkweed? And the person didn't say where they're from, but if you have any suggestions about finding nurseries.
Yeah, so just, I mean, two quick things. Even this late, it's not too late to start milkweed from seed. And, terrestrial seed has it, Southern Exposure seed has it. I think just about every seed company you can get milkweed seeds delivered, and I've started some out in little peat pots, and the reason I'm saying it's not too late is I started those seeds probably 2 months ago, and they are still only that tall, because they start to really show themselves later in the summer. You really start to see them sort of perk up, and it just hasn't really gotten warm enough to set them out. I don't think they're going to be happy, and so I'm sort of babying them. They're outside right now. I'm hardening those seeds off, but right now a lot of places are having native plant sales. If you go to the native, Virginia Native Plant Society, they've got a list of all the plant sales that are going right now. I believe that Lewis Ginter Botanical Gardens is having theirs on Friday and Saturday of this week. Boy, what a joy that would be. So yeah, there are several, and a lot of the master naturalists and master gardeners right now, they're having their native plant sales as well.
That's exactly what I was going to say is about Lewis Ginter. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So this question, man, can you discuss the impact of cicadas on your garden?
Yeah, so what cicadas are feeding on are the roots, right, of trees before they come up. I don't think they're actually going to do that much damage to above ground. What they've eaten below ground. So I think we're going to hear them, and they may be annoying if you're walking your dog at night or trying to go to sleep, but I don't think that that's going to be you know, I don't think they're going to do tremendous damage to our landscapes.
I'm very excited about this, the big cicada year. Okay, so my yard has a lot of azaleas. How are they in terms of supporting pollinators?
Not great. No, I mean, okay, so there's one, the pinkster azalea, you know, is a native and it's great. There's a list of, I don't know, 11 to 15 Lepidoptera that it's great for, but our non-native azaleas are not great. They're beautiful, and I completely understand why people have them in their yard. If you ever watch the Masters, like I don't play golf, but I'm like, I really want to just walk around and look at all those gorgeous colors because it really is stunning. So I'm not telling you to get rid of your azaleas, but maybe mix in some of the pinkster, because if your non-native azaleas are doing well, the pinkster azalea will also do well. It needs the same sort of soil type. It likes it a little wetter maybe than the natives do, but than the non-natives do.
We keep looking through our questions.
I see one from Callie that we sort of skipped. It says, how do you stratify milkweeds?
Yes.
Yeah, so, you know, the directions on the seed pack, by the way, they tell you, put them in the refrigerator for 3 weeks, right? So you plant the milkweed on top of the soil, you put a piece of saran wrap on top of it, and then you put that in the fridge for 3 weeks, because it needs that sort of that cold time in order to, that sort of signals that yeah, it's okay to go ahead and sprout when you take it out.
Let's see, we've got a couple of questions or notes inside the chat, just so people are curious. Be very careful with your passion flower. It spreads aggressively. And then we've got some great notes about where to find seeds. So some folks are saying they have a lot of success on Etsy with home growers.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and I know there are a couple of people in this webinar right now that are the home growers that I have gotten seeds from too. So those Facebook groups and things, finding your friends.
Yeah, I love seed swaps. I mean, it's just, what's better than like opening up your mail and there's a little package in there and it's like seeds from a friend and you're going, oh, I forgot that I asked you for that. Yeah. I got some Cosmo seeds from a gardener up in Northern Virginia because I was just marveling at the colors that she had. So she sent me some Cosmo seeds.
And I have also seen you talk with people about their gardens and they've gifted you plants right there. So Anne is just so radiant and joyful that people want to give her plants. There's also a note here about the Charlottesville area, if you guys are curious. Hummingbird Hill and Gathered Threads in Charlottesville have great plant sources. So I know that's a big question. Let me see. I see a question that's about, I have a dogwood, but it's the pink kind. Should I replace it with native? And I know you've touched on this, but I'll let you say it again about native combos and non-natives.
Yeah. So if it's Cornus Florida, it's native, and whereas the Korean dogwood is not. So as long as it's Cornus Florida, you're okay. Whether it's pink or white doesn't matter. And the reason I'm saying that is the pink might be a hybrid, but it might have actually naturally hybridized, right? Somebody saw there was one blossom that was pink. They decided that they were going to reproduce that, and that's how it got into the nursery stock. There are a lot of different ways that could have happened, but I think its bracts are still the same. So it's still going to do the same thing as in terms of supporting pollinators.
I've actually heard that a lot recently from people about, you know, dogwoods are becoming so like speciated that, you know, or not speciated, but like regionally ecotypes kind of thing. So anyway, interesting plant. We've got a great question about how to get rid of invasive celandine living in wet and shady areas along the Delaware. Good luck.
Yeah, I'm not going to touch that one. I would again encourage you to go to blueridgeprism.org. Right, or you can go to the Virginia Department of Forestry site. blueridgeprism.org has a fact sheet on celandine specifically, and so you know that'll take care of that. But then the Department of Forestry, their fact sheet is really great in terms of the best time of year. There are a couple things that you actually have to spray. I hate spraying, but ailanthus is one thing that if you don't spray it, you're not going to be able to kill it. And it'll just continue to spread. But other than that.
Some more suggestions about plants. Is there a rose native to Virginia that can thrive in coastal areas without massive care?
You know, the answer is yes, and I don't know which one it is. So here's the suggestion. The resource, there is a, and somebody may want to drop the answer in the chat because it may just immediately come to them, but there is a Hampton Roads specific native plant booklet. I don't have that one at my fingertips, but there probably, I'm guessing there probably is a native rose. So let's see, Lauren, the native roses I know are palustris. Oh, the Virginia rose, of course, Carol. There you go.
So this is what the plants are all about, is the community. It's beautiful.
That's right.
Yes, and I would also like to point out, we have some questions from people that are not in Virginia. So we have, I'm going to kind of pair these together. Are there any resources similar to the ones that you've given in Virginia that are available in Maryland? And then also someone from Pennsylvania is asking, is this still relevant information for me?
Okay, yes and no. Okay, so, you know, if you look at your region, and let's say you're in Pennsylvania, you know, the central Pennsylvania, it's a different zone, for instance, so the plants specifically that I put in this presentation, they're growing in Fredericksburg, Virginia, or they're growing in Richmond, because that's like the area that I collected those photos from. That's what you saw. If I lived in the western part of the state, I would have completely different pictures. And if I lived in the Hampton Roads or Eastern Shore, again, completely different photos. So I'd encourage you to see, if you're in Pennsylvania, seek out native plant nurseries in Pennsylvania. But the message of sort of supporting pollinators with native plants still applies. It just might be different plants that are suited for your zone and for your, you know, your soils.
And do you know any of the specific places you would send someone to in Maryland, or just the same native plant nursery kind of suggestion?
I don't.
That's fine.
I will. I normally don't plug nurseries, but I'm going to say one. Octaro in Kirkwood, Pennsylvania. I've been so impressed with their stock. We've used a lot of it for restoration events. We got 200 trees from there. It's reasonably priced, and I've just been, I've been in love with their trees. So you may go, well, that's sourcing a long way from where I live, unless you live in Pennsylvania or Maryland, because it's just across the border. But boy, their stock was worth it. It's beautiful. It's reasonably priced. It's got great root structure. I sent Jim a note and I said, I could not be more happy with the trees and the shrubs that we got from him.
That's awesome. Yeah, and my 2 cents, not that I am the expert here, is if Anne's asked you to replace 1/10 of your lawn, that's maybe 1 tree. And you know, the trees are East Coast kind of general, but maybe I'm just dreaming big because I want to now go out and start my garden and plant lots of trees.
Yeah, so yeah, you talking about Kathleen's question?
Oh yes, do you want to answer that one? Do you see it?
Yeah, so Kathleen's asking, she says, Anne mentioned removing 1/10 of the lawn, and what would that do? So we said that it would reduce nitrogen going into the Virginia portion of the watershed by 250,000 pounds. We also did the math for phosphorus, and that blew me away. So on the market right now, if a developer needs to buy phosphorus credits, it's roughly $10,000 per pound of phosphorus. And when we did the math, we figured out how many pounds of phosphorus that whole, well, let's take out 1/10 of our, of our lawn and put it in a conservation landscaping that's not fertilized. And it was $30 million worth of phosphorus for that 1/10 of your lawn. So yeah, it's tremendous. The benefit can be tremendous to the watershed.
So I think the rest of these questions are a lot of suggestions, if you would be willing to give. Becky's question has been waiting for a little while too. I want to touch on this. Is it too late to sow Asclepius for this year if they haven't been refrigerated, if you haven't stratified yet?
Becky, I don't think so. I put them in the fridge right now. So let's see, this is the 1st of May. I mean, it's, so, 3 weeks from now, you take them out. Let's say it takes another 2 weeks for them to germinate. They usually bloom in late July to early August. So I'd say, yeah, you would probably get blooms this year. And besides that, one other thing, I mean, every native plant sale that's happening right now, they'll have milkweed, right? I mean, it'd be hard to imagine them not having milkweed. It might be the first thing to, to sell, but they'll have it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We got some questions about what I should put on in flower baskets. Should I replace them because I used petunias and lantana in the past? That's the first plant you taught me, by the way, was lantana.
Really? Okay. Yeah. So what do I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about my baskets. All right. So I love structure in a basket, not in a basket. I love structure in a container. So I will usually plant something that's a grass, right? So pink muley grass, for instance, or little blue stem in the center, because that's going to give you color. It's going to give you some height, and then I'll do stuff that sort of will trail around that if I'm doing a pot. But the other thing is I've got hanging geraniums right now, and out on the front porch because they're bright red. The birds will, of course, nest in the in the hanging pot, and I've got ferns out there hanging on the porch. But I guess I'm not a purist. I'm sure there are folks that are, but but I've got a mix of annuals I've got pansies out in the front yard right now. They're still doing their part. They're still attracting pollinators. They're not providing as much benefit to habitat as maybe some native spring flowering plants would, but they're still saying, hey, come on in. And I see bees out there right now foraging on them.
Does it bring you joy?
That's right. They bring me joy.
They bring you joy. I got a question. Well, first of all, I wanted to add a couple notes from the chat. So mixing slate in with the soil might help with like our ground digging friends like moles and voles. And someone had added that the National Wildlife Federation has a book out by, oh God bless this person's last name, David Mizajowski, called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. So if that is something you would like. We did get a question. Do you know if Octoraro is wholesale only? You know?
I don't know, and I'm sorry that I suggested them if they are wholesale only. Yeah, I didn't realize that. I thought that they were wholesale and retail. I apologize if they're only wholesale.
I mean, maybe this will just be the next business step for them because of you, man.
Well, okay, so let me back up for a second. If somebody's looking for plants, the Bay Foundation. So thank you, Carol. The Bay Foundation uses a lot of plants from Sandy's plants. I don't know if you've ever gone out there before, but boy, talking about bringing you joy, what is more fun than riding a golf cart around acres and acres and acres of plants, of which she carries a wide variety of natives. It's like the most fun that you can have on a Saturday afternoon. So Unfortunately, I don't think they let you drink in the golf cart, because I really do think that just like a bucket of champagne and some champagne flutes and tooling around the golf cart would just be the most fun ever. But I think she might frown on that.
So my friends, all right, 7:15, we've got a couple more questions I want to get to, and we'll see what else pops up into the chat. And one more note, mdflora.org is a great place to start for Maryland, but I see Richard's question in here. What is the best way to get rid of grass and weeds in the area to be planted?
Looking good, Blair. Yeah, I see you, Richard. Okay, so two ways. When we put in conservation landscaping, God bless our volunteers, but when we did it in Hopewell, so two things. A flat blade shovel, right? One that there is no point to it. It's just straight across. You get that thing parallel to the soil, give it a good kick, and you will be pulling up, a sheet of grass. It's going to pull up a lot of the roots, and then you're going to have to shake a lot of the soil off the roots. That's one way. The second way is if you're able to plan ahead, and ideally, if you're going to redo a large section, you're going to want to probably plant in the fall, right? In the fall, that's when the roots are going to, the roots are going to grow, and more so than the top, right? And so that's why we say it's the best time to plant, herbaceous and shrubs in the fall. So the thing to do is to put black plastic down, and just put something over top of it. Just hay bales are fine, just something to weigh it down for just a couple weeks. And then, that will kill the weeds. And then, or I say the weeds, the grass and the weeds. And then you're going to be able to plant in that area. And you're really not going to have to do much in terms of, unless you've got a really, really thick mat. Like if you've got zoysia grass, for instance, you may have some, you might have a mat there, but other than, I think you'd plant straight in it.
The most character building I have ever done is removing grass. So,
you sure wouldn't digging a, gigantic rain garden by hand. We've done some big ones.
We have, and I also remember digging a test hole for a rain garden in a dress. I looked like a 50s housewife. So, with a Bay Foundation, you do it all. We've got two more questions that are left, and we're getting a lot of great suggestions, y'all, about where to find seeds and where to find other people that like native plants. So all of this is going to be sent, the presentation is going to be sent to you. So don't forget, don't panic, you're going to get resources. But that last one is from Rebecca. In terms of layering plants, what would be some good ones to be compatible with one another to attract pollinators? It's a tough question.
Okay. So I'm sort of laughing because I see the next question, which is talking about how do I remove wild violets from my flower bed? So I'll just say wild violets are also great for pollinators. So my mom will yank them all up, but they really do wonderful. So, okay, so if you're wanting to plant in raised garden beds, I'm guessing that you're talking about that you want flowering plants there. So is wild bleeding heart deer, I don't know. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. All right, so give me a second. So I love purple and yellow combinations. And so I'm always thinking about, can I put garden phlox and rudbeckia? Can I use coreopsis? Like there's so many different coreopsis. The threadleaf coreopsis is beautiful. That will continue to spread over time. So once you've got one, you can always sort of in the fall, you can take little parts of it and move it to different parts, and then you'll have it all over. Achillea is in this picture. That's, well, I'm not showing the slide anymore, I'm sorry, but my final slide had yarrow in it, achillea. And now it's starting to come in different colors, but you know, the native is either white or yellow, but now you can also get it in this really beautiful crimson. Let's see. Yeah, so, you know, again, I'm always trying to think of, I want something blooming in the spring, and I want something that's blooming midsummer, and then ideally something that's blooming in the fall. So, you know, solidago and asters are sort of the go-to for the fall. There's a gazillion things that will bloom in the summer. And then, you know, I use like columbine in the spring, you know, bleeding heart, the wild geranium. There's those things that are batista is, you know, is another, lupin is another. They're all spring flowering. And then, you know, I'm just trying to sort of build that bed so that something is blooming as something else goes away.
That's a great suggestion. And I think you'll enjoy this. What ferns do you prefer?
Yeah, so in my yard, I have 3. I've got an ostrich fern, I've got lady fern, and cinnamon fern. Also sensitive fern, I've got 4. They're in different parts of the yard. They have been really tough. Yeah, I'll just say that if something isn't tough, it probably doesn't do well in my yard. We just don't have time. You don't have time to be out there weeding. And speaking of weeding, I mean, going back to the violet issue, I'll just say that if you can get a good ground cover going, you don't have to weed. I mean, you know, the more you have the plant that you want there, the less room there is for a weed seed to take hold. So, you know, trying to get those ground covers actually spreading and covering the ground will greatly reduce the amount of weeding you got to do on the weekends.
I think you kind of already addressed Robert's question about
I don't know, Robert. You don't know. You know, I don't know. He asked, so the question is wild bleeding heart dicentra considered relatively deer resistant? I don't know. Let's see. I mean, I'm trying to think what I had in my yard in Williamsburg that deer didn't touch. Like, for instance, they don't touch May apples. You know, the whole backyard was filled with them, and they left them alone. But I don't know about bleeding heart. Yeah, then another plant that is, it's not native, but it is. Yeah, I won't go there. There are a handful of plants that are deer resistant. That, yeah, but they're not native, so we won't go there.
Well, we seem that the Q&A is kind of starting to slow down. I'm taking this to mean that everyone is like really excited to go. Yeah, everyone wants to go to Google right now and get their satellite photo and start drawing. So
thank you to my great moderators. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much.